chapter. Okay, great. It says we are live on YouTube, so that's wonderful. Welcome to our YouTube audience. So glad to have everybody here today. All right, we have so much to cover, so let's get started. If you haven't seen some of the previous episodes, we've already been talking about this book, 10% Human, How Your Body's Microbes Hold the Key to Health and Happiness. And we're going to actually start off by reading an excerpt because I think this excerpt is very helpful and is going to give us sort of a picture of the kickoff point where we're starting from. And I think this relates to a lot of us, which is also super important because if you can't put yourself in the scene, then you ask yourself, what does this have to do with me? So let's take a look. On page 38 of the chapter 10% Human, 21st Century Sickness, she kicks off with, looking around your family and friends, you won't see smallpox, measles, or polio anymore. You may think how lucky we are, how healthy we are these days. But look again, and you might see things differently. You might see sneezing and red, itchy eyes of your daughter's hay fever in the spring. You might think of your sister-in-law who has to inject herself with insulin several times a day because of her type 1 diabetes. You might be worried your wife will end up in a wheelchair with multiple sclerosis as her aunt did. You might have heard about your dentist's little boy who screams and rocks himself and won't make eye contact now that he has autism. You might get impatient with your mother who is too anxious to do the shopping. You might be searching for a washing powder that doesn't make your son's eczema worse. Your cousin might be the awkward one at the dinner who can't eat wheat because he gives her diarrhea. Your neighbor might have slipped unconscious while searching for his EpiPen after accidentally eating nuts. And you might have lost the battle to keep your weight where beauty magazines and your doctor say it should be. These conditions, allergies, autoimmune diseases, digestive troubles, mental health problems, and obesity are the new normal. Let's take allergies. Perhaps there's nothing alarming about your daughter's hay fever, as 20% of her friends also sniffle and sneeze their way through the summer. You are not surprised by your son's eczema because 1 in 5 of his classmates have it too. Your neighbor's anaphylactic attack, terrifying though it was, is common enough that all packaged foods carry a warning that they may contain nuts. But have you ever asked yourself why 1 in 5 of your children's friends have to take an inhaler to school in case they suffer an asthma attack? Being able to breathe is fundamental to life, yet without medication, millions of children would find themselves gasping for breath. What about why 1 in 15 children are allergic to at least one type of food? Can that be normal? Allergies affect nearly half of us in developing countries, with dutifully taking our antihistamines amid picking up the cat and checking the ingredients list of everything we buy. We unthinkingly do what is necessary to stop our immune systems overreacting to the most ubiquitous and innocuous of substances: pollen, dust, pet hair, milk, eggs, nuts, and so on. These substances are being treated by the body as if they are germs that needed to be attacked and removed. It hasn't always been this way. In the 1930s, asthma was rare, affecting perhaps 1 child in every school. By the 1980s, it had shot up, and 1 child in every class was affected. In the last decade or so, the rise has leveled off, but it has left 1/4 of our children with asthma. The same goes for other allergies. Peanut allergies, for instance, trebled just in 10 years. At the end of the last century, and then doubled again for the next 5 years. Now we have nut-free zones in schools and workplaces. Eczema and hay fever, too, were once rare and are now a fact of life. This is not normal. What about autoimmune disease? Your sister-in-law's insulin habit is common enough, with type 1 diabetes affecting, as it does, about 4 in every 1,000 people. Most people have heard of multiple sclerosis or MS that destroyed your wife's aunt's nerves. And then there's rheumatoid arthritis wrecking joints, celiac disease attacking the gut, myositis shredding muscles fibers, lupus pulling apart cells at their core, and about 80 other such conditions. As with allergies, the immune system has gone rogue, attacking not just germs that bring disease, but the body's own cells. You might be surprised to learn that among them, autoimmune disease affects nearly 10% of the population in the developed world. Type 1 diabetes, T1D, makes for a great example because it is an unmistakable condition, so records are relatively reliable. Type 1 is the version of diabetes that usually strikes early, often in the teenage years, attacking the cells of the pancreas and completely preventing the production of the hormone insulin. In type 2 diabetes, insulin is produced, but the body has grown less sensitive to it, so it doesn't work as well. Without insulin, any glucose in the blood, whether that's from a simple sugar in sweets and desserts or from a carbohydrate in pasta and bread, cannot be converted and stored. It builds up and quickly becomes toxic, bringing with it a rage of thirst and constant need for urination for the unfortunate teenager. The patient wastes away, and weeks or months later, death follows, often by kidney failure, that is, unless insulin is injected. Pretty serious. Fortunately, compared to most conditions, it's straightforward to diagnose and always has been. These days, a quick check of the amount of glucose in the blood and fasting usually gives it away. But even 100 years ago, diabetes could be detected by a willing doctor. I will say, because the first test for it involved tasting the patient's urine. A sweetness within the tang indicated that there was so much glucose in the blood that it had been forced out in the urine by the kidneys. Though undoubtedly more causes were missed in the past than now, and many would have gone unrecorded, our understanding of the prevalence of type 1 diabetes over time is a reliable indicator and a changing status of autoimmune disease. About 1 in 250 people in the West are stuck playing the role of their own pancreas, calculating how much insulin they need and then injecting it to store away the glucose they have consumed. What's extraordinary is that this high prevalence is new. Type 1 diabetes was almost non-existent in the 19th century. Hospital records for Massachusetts General Hospital in the US kept over 75 years until 1898. Log only 21 cases of diabetes diagnosed in childhood out of nearly 500,000 patients. It's not a case of misdiagnosis either. That urine taste test, a rapid weight loss, and the inevitable fatal outcome made the disease easy to recognize even back then. Once formal records had been set up just before the Second World War, a prevalence of type 1 diabetes could be tracked. Around 1 or 2 children in every 5,000 were affected in the US, UK, and Scandinavia. The war itself altered nothing, but long afterwards, something changed and cases began to rise. By 1973, diabetes was 6 or 7 times as common as it had been in the 30s. In the 80s, the rise leveled off at a current figure of about 1 in 250. The rise in diabetes is matched by rises in other autoimmune conditions. Multiple sclerosis destroys the nervous system of twice as many people at the turn of the millennium as it did 2 decades previously. Celiac disease, in which the presence of wheat prompts the body to attack the cells of the intestine, is startlingly 30 to 40 times as common now as it was in the 1950s. Lupus, inflammatory bowel disease, and rheumatoid arthritis, too, have been on the rise. This is not normal. What about our collective battle with the excess weight? Odds are I'm right in the flippant assumption that you are struggling with your weight, as well as half of us in the Western world are either overweight or obese. It is astonishing to think that being healthy weight puts you in the minority now. Being fat is so typical that that old shop mannequins have been replaced by larger versions. The television shows turned weight loss into a game. These changes are perhaps to be expected. Statistically speaking, being overweight is the reality for most people, but it didn't used to be. To us now, looking back at black and white photographs of skinny young men and women in their 30s and 40s enjoying a spell of hot weather in their shorts and swimwear, these healthy people appeared emaciated with predominant ribs and lean bellies, but they're not. They're simply not carrying modern baggage. At the start of the 20th century, human body weights were uniform enough that few thought to keep records, but it prompted by a sudden rise in weight gain in the 1950s at the epicenter of the obesity epidemic, America. The government began to keep track. In its first national survey in the early 1960s, 13% of adults were already obese. That is, they had a body mass index weight in kilograms divided by height into meters squared of over 30. A further 30% were overweight with a BMI between 25 and 30. By 1999, the proportion of obese American adults had more than doubled by 30%, and many previously healthy adults had piled on the pounds, keeping an overweight category at a plump 34%. That's a total of 64% overweight and obese. Trends in the UK followed the same pattern with a bit of a lag in 1966. Just 1.5% of the adult population were obese and 11% were overweight. By 1999, 24% were obese, 43% overweight. That's 67% of the people now heaviest than they should be. Heavier than they should be. Obesity is not just about excess weight either. It can lead to type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and even some cancers, all of which are increasingly common. You don't need me to tell you this is not normal. Tummy troubles too are on the rise. Your cousin may be awkward for trying out a gluten-free diet, but she's probably not the only one at the table who suffers from irritable bowel syndrome, which affects up to 15% of the people. The name implies a similar level of discomfort to a midge bite. She's British, so every once in a while there's a phrase that throws me off. I apologize. And bellies, the ruinous impact of the conditions of the quality of life of their sufferers. Proximity to the toilet takes priority over a more meaningful pursuit for most sufferers, and near absence of need for one makes pursuit of another, but colonic relief worthless for the remaining patients. Inflammatory bowel disease like Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, too, are on the rise, leaving the worst affected with a bowel so damaged it has been replaced by a colostomy bag outside the body. This is definitely not normal. And finally, we come to mental health conditions. Your dentist's autistic son has more company than ever before. 1 in 68 children, but 1 in every 42 boys are on the autistic spectrum. Back in the early 1940s, autism was so rare, it hadn't even been given a name. Even by the time records began in 2000, it was less than half as common as it is now. You'd be right by thinking that at least some of these extra cases are due to an increasing awareness and perhaps some overdiagnosis. But most experts agree that the rise in autism prevalence is genuine. Something has changed. Attention deficit disorders, Tourette's syndrome, and obsessive compulsive disorders are all also on the rise. Depression and anxiety disorders are too. This increase in mental suffering is not normal, except these conditions are now so very normal that you may not even have realized that they are new illnesses, rarely encountered by our great-grandparents and those before them. Even doctors are often unaware of the histories of the conditions they treat, having received their medical training only in the context of today's doctors' experiences. And with the rise of cases of appendicitis, a change forgotten by today's medics, what matters most to frontline caregivers is frontline carriers is the patient in their charge. and the treatment available to them. Understanding the prevalence of illness is not the responsibility, and as such, changes in the prevalence are incidental to them. In the 21st century, life is different thanks to 4 public health innovations in the 19th century and 20th centuries. And so disease is different too. But our 21st century illnesses are not simply another layer of ill health hidden beneath infectious disease, but an alternative set of conditions created by the way we live now. At this point, you might be wondering how these illnesses can possibly have something in common, such as a disparate group do they see? Such a disparate group do they seem? From the sneezing and itching of allergies to the self-destruction of autoimmunity, the metabolic misery of obesity, and the humiliation of digestive disorders, and the stigma of mental health conditions, it's as if our bodies, in the absence of infectious disease, have turned on themselves. We could accept our new fate and gratefully that we will at least live long lives free from tyranny of pathogens. Or we could ask, what has changed? Could there be a link between the conditions that seem unrelated, like obesity and allergies, irritable bowel syndrome, and autism? Does the shift from infectious disease to this new set of illnesses indicate that our bodies need infections to stay balanced? Or is the correlation between declining infectious disease and the rising chronic illness merely hinting at a deeper cause? What are we left with but one big question? Why are the 21st century illnesses happening? Okay, so that, if you're interested in going back and reading it, is the top of page 38 through the bottom of page 43. And I really like this section of the chapter because I feel like she spells out exactly what's going on in the 21st century. And I think it's important for us to see the big picture because we live really busy lives. I think oftentimes we just go through the motions until we hit an obstacle. And an obstacle might be one of these issues, whether it's an allergy, a sudden weight gain, a slow weight gain, whether it has to do with a change in your mood, whether you're falling into depression or you're tending towards anxiety. You have a child with autism, or maybe you have a child with attention deficit disorder. Maybe you yourself are falling into a situation where you can't focus. All of these things have a correlation, if not a similar causation. And that's really what this book is going to explore. And I think is so exciting in terms of the fact that I believe that we're on a path to a solution. Now, if you feel that when you listen to this, you're kind of overwhelmed and you feel a little bit of despair and lack of hope, I want you to go to the beginning of the chapter, and we're going to briefly go through this with her. I'm not going to read it like I did that really important section of this chapter, but I'm going to highlight what she covers because I believe the fact that we have been somewhere before and have gone through it and found some solutions and made progress means that as a human society, as a global society of really intelligent people, we can pull together our common knowledge and find solutions to this situation as well. But I believe that all of us can benefit from taking some time to step back and actually look at the big picture. Sometimes I think when we don't look at the big picture, we miss some of the really important clues that we need to connect the dots and come up with a solution. So let's look at what we did in the past to do that very thing. Take a big overview, connects the dots, and come up with a solution. So at the start of her chapter on the 21st century, she actually begins with the last case of smallpox. Now, the last case of smallpox, and if you're going to try to flip through your book, go back to page 25. So in 1978, there was a photographer who had her studio above a medical laboratory where smallpox was being kept. And although smallpox had been eradicated throughout the world, there were these biolabs that kept in petri dishes a certain amount of different infectious diseases so that they can continue to study them. The tragedy in this particular case was that biolab was online to being destroyed, and yet it hadn't been when a woman by the name of Janet Parker contracted smallpox. Now, the question was, how in isolation did this woman contract smallpox? Well, they traced it back to the air vents of the building and mishandling of the smallpox petri dish that released some smallpox into the air. And she was the extremely tragically unfortunate recipient of that disease, and she succumbed to it. So let's go back and try to figure out what exactly was the environment within which infectious disease made its big performance on the world stage. I think we have to think of some of the factors first. So let's think of before the Industrial Revolution, right? So we're really talking about the very end of the 1700s, going into the 1800s and going into the 1900s, right? So we're talking about a time frame from like 1800 through 2000. And this era was known as the revolutionary era. There were revolutions of thought, and there was revolutions of governments, and there was an industrial revolution. So we went from a purely agrarian society to this new chemically incorporated, highly mechanized society that also included people emerging and being driven into these mega cities, right? So before this, we really, although we had cities, we didn't have them the way we have them today, where people were living in extremely closed quarters, and we didn't have the advance in sanitation that we do today. So just imagine living in New York City with open sewers, poor water conditions. You have, the hot summer where the haze just kind of hangs down into the city, poor lack of airflow. So there were all these kind of theories behind where sickness came from. One of them was considered, before we had germ theory, was something called miasma. And miasma was basically this idea that just things were in the air. So if the air was unclean, you could get sick. And if the air was clean, that you wouldn't get sick, which is why people were always sent up into the mountains to recover. That's where these hospitals were located. And what's interesting from an essential oil perspective, of course, and yes, you're getting out of the city, you're getting out of the crowd, you're getting out of the poor sanitation, but you're also getting into an environment which gives off a lot of essential oil. So when you go into the tree line and you go into the forest and you are up at higher elevations and you're in the mountains, you do experience a contact with a lot of really healthy microbes, and we're talking about good microbes for the gut microbiome, but you also encounter essential oils that come from these evergreen trees. So in an era when we're trying to increase our gut microbiome health, and we're trying to also combat, pathogens, which we don't want. We know that germs do still spread and cause illness, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that there is lower immunity, but there's also like this super need to highly chemical cleanse things. But we have natural ways of doing that. We have these oils that come from trees. So I'd like to highlight something that doTERRA sells called Midnight Forest, and the other one's called Northern Escape. So just think of forest and northern, right? Northern Escape, Midnight Forest. Those two essential oil blends are going to be really, really good for you to use every day. Diffuse them, especially if you spend a lot of time indoors and you don't get out. One of the things you may want to look up is something called forest bathing. It was started in Japan. It's really, really wonderful for you. I also would make a suggestion. This is a free suggestion, to take off your shoes at least once a day and walk on a clean surface outside that's natural. So if you heavily spray your lawn with chemicals, that's not the surface you're looking for. But if you live near a beach and it's clean, if you have a patch of garden that's organic, or you can go and walk in a state park or a forest, just make sure you're not going to hurt your feet on anything. But the idea is to actually connect with the earth, because the foot, when it connects with the earth, is actually going to heal your body in a really beautiful way. And some of that has to do with the microbes that you're going to come in contact with. The other recommendation that I have for you today are these two essential oils, oregano and thyme. I want you to be really consistent with using your oils that come from herbs. We know that herbs did a lot to help people in the age of infectious disease. So people who did not have access to modern medications used some of these traditional herbal medicines, and they worked. And that's what's really cool. And there's a huge history behind that. We're not going to have time to go through all this today. We're actually kind of running out of time, but I just wanted to highlight a couple of key points in how we overcame infectious disease. Okay, so I kind of set up for you as much as I could the idea that crowded cities, poor sanitation, people living on top of each other created an easy environment for pathogens to jump from person to person and infections to spread. So this kind of started in the 1900s when life expectancy was about 31 years old across the planet. Now, in the developing world, we got a little bit more time in our lifespan. We ended up with it extending to the age of 50. But we also had high infant mortality rates. Kids didn't live even till their first birthday. 3 out of 10 children passed away due to some infectious disease before they reached the age of 1. We know in traditional Chinese culture, you don't even name your child until they're 1. There's something, a sense of relief, right? I think as modern human beings and parents, we think, oh, once the child is born, we're safe, right? Like people are worried during pregnancy, they take extra good care of themselves, and birth can be a little bit scary. But then once the child is born, you have, I think as a parent, I know I did as a mom, like, phew, I made it, that I didn't miscarry, that the child was healthy, that, like we had hit, a home run. But the truth is, in not so distant past, it wasn't then. Even if your child had survived, it really wasn't until they reached the age of 1. So they had to go through an entire other year. So 9 months of pregnancy plus a whole year of just waiting out to see if this child would live. And then the life expectancy was only 31 years. So now we're really looking at 30 more years of life that they had to look forward to. So it was difficult, and we have suffering and difficulties in today's society as well, but they're of course different than they used to be. But history is really important because we can learn from our ancestors different methodologies to use to get through some of these issues. So in 1796, Edward Jenner came up with the first smallpox vaccine. And if I don't have time to go into how he did it, but it's a really cool history. It has to do with milkmaids and cows. And it's a fun story actually to tell your kids if they like science. And then hospital hygiene was kind of the second thing, right? So they're like these big innovations that we came up with that helped us get over this time period of infectious disease. One was vaccines. And the second one was hygiene. And hygiene came out of hospitals. In fact, it came out of obstetrics, because what we noticed was that in hospitals where babies were delivered, there was a higher infant mortality rate and a higher rate of death among moms in childbirth. But if they were delivered by midwives, actually they had a greater chance of survival. So there was a Hungarian obstetrician by the name of Ignaz Semmelweis, and he wanted to figure out why it was that midwives had a better rate of survival than doctors. And what he discovered was that doctors would go and train their students in between births. So a woman would come in, she's ready to give birth. They put her in a hospital room. She's not quite ready to deliver. So the doctor goes to the morgue where he's teaching his medical school students on cadavers. And in doing that, he is contracting all kinds of microbes. Now, there was no hospital hygiene. Nobody knew to wash their hands or disinfect. And of course, their clothes were also covered with tissue and blood and disease. Then, dirty as they would go over to the mom and deliver the baby, not even washing their hands and not covering their dirty clothes, or certainly we didn't have disposable clothes back then, and throwing them away. Now, why would they think that having all of that on them would, I think from a modern standpoint, it seems inconceivable. that we would show up with some, we would touch anyone if we were dirty. I mean, even I know that if I'm cooking in the kitchen and I get dirty, I take off my apron and I wash it, or I'm not going to go greet my guests at her dinner party covered with, cooking soiling. So what changed our mindset? Well, this man, which is really cool, this Hungarian obstetrician, Ignaz Semmelweis, he changed our mindset. And what he did was he connected the dots. He realized, he did the first somebody can say that for me, epidemiology study on connecting the dots between washing and hygiene and not washing. And I'll tell you, he got a lot of resistance because a lot of these doctors were very proud of what they were doing, and they wore their dirty smocks as a show of how accomplished they were. And there was also this prevailing theory that if you were a gentleman, that you would not spread disease. And remember, we had this concept of miasma, where that disease was somehow lingering in the air and you just had to change the air so that you didn't get sick. But this idea of epidemiology, this idea that you can start with some idea and then draw some conclusions. So I want you to think between now and next week, when we continue with this chapter, about a few questions. So here are the questions. We're going to apply it to today's society. So asthma, allergies, autism, obesity, autoimmune disease. Where are these diseases coming from in the world? Who are they affecting? And when did they become a problem? Okay, so I want you to think through all of those things. She has some great answers in the book. So if you want to read ahead, you can hear some of the theories that she puts forward. I think they're amazing. I love this book. I hope you're enjoying it. Thank you so much for joining me today. And I really appreciate her writing and taking us on this journey into healing our gut microbiome and the microbiome as a whole, and overcoming some of the modern conditions that are causing health problems in the United States and all over the world. I'm Carrie Donegan. Thank you so much for joining me. I'll see you next week on YouTube and on Win Win Women Network at 11 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, Monday. This is our new time slot. Yay. I hope you like it. You can always watch the replay. Bye.